The Boeing 747 carved through turbulent skies at 37,000 feet when Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, with an urgency that made seasoned travelers look up from their magazines. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a unique situation developing. If there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." The words hung in the pressurized air like a loaded weapon, and in row 11, seat C, Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Ghost Reyes didn't even stir from her sleep. She'd been unconscious for 3 hours, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that came from 16 months of back-to-back deployments. The small woman with calloused hands and premature silver streaks in her black hair looked unremarkable in civilian clothes, jeans, a faded university sweatshirt, and worn sneakers. Nothing about her suggested she'd logged over 2,000 combat hours in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, or that she held the unofficial record for most enemy aircraft neutralized by a female pilot in modern warfare. The flight attendant, Jessica, moved through the cabin with practiced urgency, scanning faces for anyone who might fit the profile of military personnel. She passed row 11 twice, her eyes briefly settling on the sleeping woman before moving on. Veterans, Jessica had learned, usually carried themselves differently: straighter spines, sharper awareness, hands that never quite relaxed. This passenger looked like any other exhausted traveler heading home from a business trip. But 4 rows back, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had heard the captain's call and was already unbuckling his seatbelt. Webb, a 24-year-old transport pilot with exactly 93 flight hours under his belt, felt his pulse quicken as he raised his hand. The flight attendant's face flooded with relief as she hurried toward him, and Webb straightened his shoulders, trying to project the confidence he didn't quite feel. "Sir, we need you to come forward immediately," Jessica whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly around the edges. "The captain needs to speak with you." As Webb made his way toward the cockpit, other passengers began to murmur among themselves. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted from routine boredom to electric tension, and even the most oblivious travelers sensed something was wrong. Outside the small windows, the sky had taken on an ominous quality, dark clouds rolling in from the east like gathering smoke from a distant fire. In row 11, Ghost Reyes slept on, her breathing deep and even. Her hand rested loosely on her lap, fingers unconsciously curved as if gripping an invisible flight stick. 22 years of military service had taught her to sleep anywhere, anytime, but it had also honed her instincts to a razor's edge. Deep in her subconscious, some part of her warrior's mind was already stirring, sensing disturbance in the careful order of things. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it encountered another pocket of turbulence, and somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Morrison was about to discover that the young sergeant approaching his door might not be enough for what was coming. Staff Sergeant Webb knocked on the cockpit door with a confidence that evaporated the moment Captain Morrison turned to face him. Morrison was a 28-year veteran of commercial aviation, a man who'd flown through everything from Category 5 hurricanes to engine failures over the Pacific. His weathered face usually carried the calm assurance of someone who'd seen every possible emergency. But today, something different lurked behind his steel-gray eyes, something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Sergeant Webb," Morrison said, reading the name from the hastily scribbled note Jessica had passed him. "Thank you for responding. I need to ask you some questions and I need honest answers. What's your flight experience?" Webb straightened, trying to project authority despite feeling suddenly very young. "Sir, I'm qualified on the C-130 Hercules. I've got 93 hours of flight time, mostly transport and cargo operations. Basic formation flying, some instrument training." "Combat experience?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Webb's throat felt dry. "No, sir, training only." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his co-pilot, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, a former Navy pilot herself, caught the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Outside the cockpit windows, the horizon was beginning to tell a story that civilian pilots were never supposed to read. Three black dots, barely visible against the cloud cover, maintained a perfect triangular formation exactly 2 miles off their starboard side. "Sergeant," Morrison said carefully, "I'm going to show you something, and I need you to tell me what you see." He gestured toward the radar display, where 3 distinct blips pulsed in steady rhythm. "Those contacts have been shadowing us for the past 40 minutes. They're military aircraft, F-15 Eagles based on their flight profile, and they're not responding to any radio calls." Webb studied the display, his training kicking in despite his nervousness. "Sir, that's not normal civilian air traffic control. Military intercept patterns usually indicate," he stopped, the implications hitting him like cold water. "Usually indicate what, Sergeant?" "Hostile intent, sir, or a security threat." Webb's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I don't understand. This is civilian airspace. We're a commercial flight. There's no reason for—" "There's every reason," Morrison interrupted, his voice grim. 40 minutes ago, we received a coded transmission that our aircraft has been flagged as a potential threat. Someone aboard this plane has triggered a national security alert." The cockpit fell silent except for the steady hum of engines and the occasional crackle of radio static. Webb felt his world tilting slightly off its axis. This wasn't the routine cargo runs he was used to. This wasn't training. This was something else entirely, something that made his 93 hours of flight time feel like 93 minutes. "Sir, what do you need me to do?" Morrison exchanged a glance with Hayes, and in that look was a conversation that Webb couldn't quite read but understood instinctively. They were asking him to step into something far beyond his pay grade, something that would require skills he wasn't sure he possessed. "We need you to help us figure out why those F-15s are out there," Morrison said quietly. "And we need to do it before they decide we're too much of a threat to leave alone." In row 11, Ghost Ray's eyes snapped open. She hadn't heard the conversation in the cockpit, hadn't seen the radar display or the ominous formations outside. But 22 years of combat had given her senses that operated below the threshold of conscious thought, and right now, every one of those senses was screaming that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. She sat up slowly, her body automatically running through a mental systems check, heart rate elevated but controlled, breathing steady, muscle tension optimal for rapid response. Around her, the other passengers continued their nervous chatter, but Ghost filtered out their voices and focused on the subtle changes in engine pitch, the slight variations in the aircraft's attitude, the way the flight attendants moved through the cabin with just a fraction more urgency than normal. Her hand moved instinctively to her left wrist, fingers finding the small scar that marked where her pilot's watch usually sat. She'd left it in her carry-on bag, along with most of the other markers of her profession, but the muscle memory remained. 22 years of checking instruments, monitoring systems, staying ready for the moment when everything went wrong. That moment, she realized with crystalline clarity, was happening right now. Ghost rose from her seat with the fluid economy of movement that marked experienced pilots, her body automatically adjusting to the aircraft's motion. She could feel the 747 subtle oscillations, could sense the minute corrections the autopilot was making to maintain course and altitude. More importantly, she could feel the tension that had settled over the cabin like a low-pressure system, moving in before a storm. The flight attendant, Jessica, was making another pass through the cabin, her eyes still searching faces with barely concealed desperation. Ghost watched her approach, noting the slight tremor in the woman's hands, the way her professional smile had become a mask stretched too thin over genuine fear. "Excuse me," Ghost said quietly as Jessica passed her row. "I heard the captain's announcement. I think you might be looking for me." Jessica stopped so abruptly that she nearly stumbled. "Ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Reyes, United States Air Force, Ghost said, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the ambient noise of the cabin. Call sign Ghost. I'm a fighter pilot. The relief that flooded Jessica's features was so profound that it was almost painful to watch. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, her professional composure finally cracking. "Ma'am, the captain needs to see you immediately. There's a situation." Ghost nodded, already moving toward the aisle. She could feel the weight of curious stares from nearby passengers, could sense the shift in the cabin's energy as word began to spread in hushed whispers. A real pilot, a fighter pilot, maybe someone who could fix whatever was going wrong. As she made her way forward, Ghost's mind was already shifting into combat mode, running through mental checklists and tactical assessments. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew with absolute certainty that her peaceful flight home was about to become something else entirely. The cockpit door opened before she could knock. The moment Ghost stepped into the cockpit, the dynamic shifted like a chess piece moving into position. Captain Morrison took one look at her, really looked, and she could see recognition dawning in his eyes. This wasn't the nervous young sergeant standing awkwardly by the navigation station. This was someone who belonged in the sharp, unforgiving world of high-stakes aviation. "Lieutenant Colonel Reyes," Morrison said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there with Webb, respect certainly, but also relief so profound it was almost audible. "Thank you for coming forward." Ghost's eyes moved systematically across the instrument panel, taking in engine parameters, navigation displays, and system status indicators, with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned to read aircraft health in combat conditions. Everything looked normal, which meant the problem was external. "Show me," she said simply. Morrison gestured toward the radar display, where three contacts continued their steady triangular formation. F-15 Eagles, 2 miles out, maintaining perfect intercept positioning. They've been with us for almost an hour now, and they're not talking. Ghost studied the display for exactly 10 seconds, her mind processing angles, distances, and intercept geometry with computer-like precision. "Have you tried emergency frequencies?" "Everyone in the book," Lieutenant Commander Hayes replied from the co-pilot's seat. "Guard frequency, military air distress, even international emergency channels. Nothing." IFF interrogation. Negative response. Either they're not squawking or they're using military codes we're not cleared to receive. Ghost nodded, filing away each piece of information in the growing tactical picture. Her attention shifted to Staff Sergeant Webb, who was watching the exchange with the wide-eyed fascination of someone witnessing a master class in something he was only beginning to understand. "Sergeant, what's your assessment of their formation?" she asked. Webb straightened, grateful to be included. "Ma'am, it's textbook intercept positioning. If they were planning an engagement, they'd have one high, one low, and one trailing for cleanup. But they're maintaining altitude parity and equal spacing, which suggests surveillance and containment," Ghost finished. "Good. You've been paying attention in your tactical briefings." The praise seemed to steady Webb's nerves, and Ghost filed that observation away as well. In crisis situations, confidence was contagious, and she'd need every advantage she could get. "Captain Morrison," she said, turning back to the veteran pilot, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened before they showed up. Everything. Radio calls, course deviations, anything out of the ordinary." Morrison's jaw tightened. "That's the thing, Colonel. Nothing happened. We've been on course, on schedule, following our filed flight plan to the letter. The only unusual event was a coded transmission we received about 45 minutes ago." "What kind of coded transmission?" "Military frequency. Automated message indicating that our aircraft had been flagged as a potential security threat. No explanation, no follow-up. Just an alert code and instructions to maintain course and altitude pending further guidance." Ghost felt the familiar chill that came with pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, pieces that formed a picture she didn't like at all. The radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence in the cockpit. The voice that came through was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. United Airlines Flight 847, this is Raptor Lead. You are directed to follow my aircraft to Nellis Air Force Base for immediate landing and inspection. Acknowledge. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Ghost could see the calculations running behind Morrison's eyes: fuel consumption, passenger safety, the implications of military diversion. These were decisions no commercial pilot should ever have to make. "Colonel," Morrison said quietly, "what do I tell them?" Ghost stared at the radio for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities and protocols. She'd been on the other side of this equation before. The interceptor, not the intercepted. She knew exactly what those F-15 pilots were thinking, what their orders probably were, and what would happen if this situation escalated beyond words. "Tell them you're complying," she said finally. "But first, patch me through military frequency." Morrison's hands moved over the radio controls with practiced efficiency. "You're live, Colonel." Ghost keyed the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 22 years of military command. "Raptor Lead, this is Ghost. I need to speak with your flight commander." The response came back almost immediately, and there was something different in the tone: curiosity, perhaps even surprise. "Ghost, Raptor Lead. Say again your call sign and unit." "Lieutenant Colonel Valentina Reyes, 388th Fighter Wing, call sign Ghost. Currently aboard United 847 as a passenger. I need to speak with whoever's running this intercept." A longer pause this time, and Ghost could almost hear the radio chatter happening on frequencies she couldn't monitor. The F-15 pilots were talking to someone, probably running her call sign through databases, checking credentials, trying to figure out if she was legitimate or part of whatever threat they'd been sent to contain. When the voice came back, it carried a note of cautious respect. "Ghost, Raptor Lead, stand by for home plate." Ghost smiled grimly. Home plate meant they were patching her through to ground control, probably someone with stars on their collar who could make decisions about the fate of 247 passengers and crew. Someone who might listen to reason before this situation spiraled completely out of control. The cockpit fell silent again as they waited, and Ghost used the time to study the men around her. Morrison was handling the stress better than most civilians would, but she could see the strain in the way he gripped the controls. Hayes was maintaining professional composure, but her knuckles were white where they rested on her knee. Webb looked like he was torn between excitement and terror. They were good people, Ghost realized. Competent professionals who'd found themselves in an impossible situation through no fault of their own. It was her job now to make sure they all went home to their families tonight. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice carried the unmistakable authority of senior command. "Ghost, this is home plate. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, 99th Air Base Wing. I need you to confirm your identity and explain your presence aboard that aircraft." Ghost keyed the microphone, and her response was crisp and professional. "Home plate, Ghost. Service number 28473619. Current assignment 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base. I'm deadheading home on leave, seat 11C. Colonel Rodriguez. I need to know what threat you think this aircraft poses, because from where I'm sitting, I see 247 innocent civilians being treated like enemy combatants." The directness of her challenge seemed to catch Rodriguez off guard. There was another pause, longer this time, before he responded. "Ghost, we received intelligence indicating that Flight 847 may be carrying hostile assets. You'll understand that I can't be more specific on an open channel." "Understood, sir. but I can tell you with absolute certainty that there are no hostile assets aboard this aircraft. I've been awake for the past 15 minutes, and I can account for every passenger in my immediate area. What you have here is a case of mistaken identity or faulty intelligence. Colonel, I appreciate your assessment, but my orders are clear. That aircraft is to be diverted to Nellie's for immediate inspection. Ghost closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She'd been in command positions before, had made calls that affected dozens of lives, but this felt different. This felt personal. Colonel Rodriguez, she said finally, I'm going to make you a deal. The silence stretched taut as everyone in the cockpit waited for her next words. Outside the windows, the F-15s maintained their precise formation, three dark angels of judgment waiting for orders that could change everything. I'm listening, Ghost. Give me 30 minutes to conduct my own security sweep of this aircraft. If I find anything at all, that suggests a legitimate threat, I'll personally recommend immediate diversion to Nellie's. But if I don't find anything, you call off your intercept and let us continue to our destination. The proposal hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before medieval knights. Ghost could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cockpit, could sense the hope and fear radiating from the passengers behind her, who had no idea their fate was being decided by radio transmissions they couldn't hear. Ghost, that's not how this works, Rodriguez replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was considering it. I have protocols to follow. So do I, sir. And right now, my protocol says I don't let innocent people get treated like terrorists because someone made a mistake. 30 minutes, Colonel. That's all I need. Another long pause, filled with static and the steady drone of engines. Ghost found herself holding her breath, aware that the next words from the radio would determine whether this ended as a minor inconvenience or a major incident that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Ghost, home plate, you have 20 minutes. But understand this, if you're wrong, if there is a threat aboard that aircraft, the responsibility falls on you. Understood, sir. Ghost out. Ghost handed the microphone back to Morrison, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. Colonel, what have you just committed us to? The right thing, she said simply. Captain, I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them we're experiencing a minor routing adjustment that requires a brief security check. Keep it calm, keep it routine. Sergeant Webb, you're with me. As she moved toward the cockpit door, Ghost felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with stepping into the unknown. She'd bought them 20 minutes to avert a crisis, but she knew that if she was wrong, if there really was something dangerous aboard this flight, those might be the last 20 minutes of freedom for everyone involved. Behind her, she could hear Morrison's voice coming through the intercom, calm and reassuring, telling nearly 250 people that everything was under control. Ghost hoped, with every fiber of her being, that it was true. Ghost moved through the cabin with the systematic precision of someone trained to spot threats in environments where a single overlooked detail could mean death. Her eyes swept over passengers with professional detachment, cataloging faces, body language, anything that might suggest hostile intent or concealed danger. Beside her, Staff Sergeant Webb followed her lead, trying to match her methodical approach despite his obvious nervousness. What exactly are we looking for, ma'am? Webb whispered as they paused at row 7 to scan the surrounding passengers. Anything that doesn't belong, Ghost replied quietly. Someone sweating when they shouldn't be, avoiding eye contact when everyone else is curious about what's happening, hands positioned to conceal something. Trust your instincts, Sergeant. Your brain processes more information than your conscious mind realizes. They moved past a middle-aged businessman reading a legal brief, a young mother soothing her fussy toddler, an elderly couple sharing a crossword puzzle. Normal people living normal lives, caught up in circumstances beyond their understanding or control. Ghost felt a familiar weight settling on her chest, the responsibility of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. In row 15, she paused. A man in his 30s sat alone, staring out the window with an intensity that seemed out of place. His hands were clenched in his lap, and Ghost could see the slight tremor that suggested either fear or adrenaline. She moved closer, her trained eyes taking in details: expensive suit, quality shoes, a laptop bag that seemed heavier than it should be. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly, projecting calm authority. "I'm conducting a routine security check. May I see your identification?" The man turned toward her, and Ghost saw something flicker behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, United States Air Force. Your ID, please." He reached into his jacket with careful deliberation, and Ghost tensed slightly, ready to react if his hand emerged with anything other than identification. But he produced only a diplomatic passport, which he handed over with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "James Whitmore," he said. "State Department. I'm returning from a conference in Geneva." Ghost studied the passport, noting the diplomatic stamps, the official seals, the man's photograph. Everything appeared legitimate, but something about his demeanor still bothered her. She handed the document back and was about to move on when she noticed something that made her stop cold. On his wrist was a watch, expensive, precise, and displaying not just local time but a second time zone. The second display showed Moscow time. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said neutrally, but her mind was racing. A State Department official returning from Geneva wouldn't need Moscow time on his watch unless he was conducting business there as well. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the kind of detail that separated routine security checks from life-or-death investigations. She continued her sweep through the cabin, her senses now heightened to maximum alertness. Webb followed, and she could see that he'd picked up on her increased tension without understanding its source. Good. He was learning to read the subtle cues that marked the difference between theoretical training and real-world application. In row 23, Ghost encountered another anomaly. A woman traveling alone, professionally dressed, with a carry-on bag that seemed to contain something heavy and metallic based on how it settled against her leg. When Ghost asked for identification, the woman's response was just a fraction too quick, too rehearsed. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, producing credentials that identified her as a researcher with a pharmaceutical company. "I'm carrying medical samples if that's what you're concerned about." "What kind of samples, doctor?" "Prototype medications. They're properly documented with customs, all completely legal." Ghost nodded and moved on, but she made a mental note of the seat number. Two passengers with explanations that were perfectly reasonable on the surface, but felt somehow incomplete. In her experience, coincidences like that were usually anything but coincidental. By the time she'd covered 3/4 of the aircraft, Ghost had identified 4 individuals whose behavior or circumstances warranted closer scrutiny. Nothing definitive, nothing that would justify the military intercept on its own, but enough inconsistencies to suggest that someone aboard this flight was not who they claimed to be. Her radio crackled softly, a discreet earpiece she'd borrowed from the flight crew to maintain communication with the cockpit. Morrison's voice came through with controlled urgency. "Colonel, we're getting pressure from home plate. They want a preliminary report." Ghost keyed her response. "Still conducting sweep. Need 10 more minutes." "Copy that. How are we looking?" Ghost paused, watching Dr. Vasquez through peripheral vision as the woman shifted nervously in her seat. "Unclear. Some anomalies, but nothing definitive yet." "Understood. Keep us posted." Ghost continued her methodical search, aware that time was running short and that lives hung in the balance of her assessment. The F-15 escorts were still out there, their pilots undoubtedly growing more impatient with each passing minute. If she called this wrong, If she missed a genuine threat or identified innocent people as dangerous, the consequences would ripple far beyond this single flight. In the final section of the aircraft, Ghost found what she was looking for, though not in the way she'd expected. Seat 34A contained a man who looked like a million other business travelers. Suit, briefcase, the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent too much time in airports. But when Ghost approached him for the routine identification check, his reaction was subtly wrong. Not the obvious nervousness of someone with something to hide, but the carefully controlled calm of someone trained to appear normal under scrutiny. "Marcus Chen," he said, handing over a driver's license and business card. "I'm in pharmaceutical sales." Ghost studied the documents, noting the crisp newness of the license, the generic corporate logo on the business card. "What company, Mr. Chen?" "Global Tech Pharmaceuticals. We specialize in overseas distribution of medical supplies." "Interesting," Ghost said casually. "Are you familiar with Dr. Alina Vasquez? She's also in pharmaceuticals, traveling in business class." The flicker was so brief that most people would have missed it entirely, but Ghost had spent years reading faces in life-or-death situations. Chen knew that name, and his knowledge scared him. "I'm not familiar with that name," he said, but the denial came just a fraction of a second too late. Ghost nodded and moved away, but her mind was now working at full speed. Two people in pharmaceuticals who knew each other but were pretending not to. A State Department official with Moscow time on his watch. A heavy carry-on bag containing unspecified medical samples. Individually, each element could be innocent. Together, they formed a pattern that made her skin crawl. She made her way back toward the cockpit, her 20-minute deadline rapidly approaching. Behind her, she could sense the subtle tension that had settled over the cabin as passengers began to realize that this wasn't a routine security check. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain normalcy, but the atmosphere had shifted into something brittle and strained. In the galley area, Ghost paused to collect her thoughts. She had pieces of a puzzle, but not enough to see the complete picture. What she did have was a growing certainty that the military intelligence that had triggered this intercept wasn't entirely wrong. There was something happening aboard this flight, something that involved at least 4 passengers who weren't who they claimed to be. The question now was what to do about it. Ghost entered the cockpit with less than 3 minutes remaining on her self-imposed deadline, and the tension in the confined space was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison looked up from his instruments with barely controlled anxiety, while Hayes maintained her professional composure through visible effort. Webb stood at the navigation station, looking like a man watching a chess match several moves beyond his understanding. "Report, Colonel," Morrison said simply. Ghost took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the fate of everyone aboard. "Captain, we have a problem. Not the kind of problem that justifies military intercept, but a problem nonetheless." She quickly outlined her findings: the pharmaceutical connection, the diplomatic passport with Moscow time, the behavioral inconsistencies that suggested coordination among passengers who were pretending not to know each other. As she spoke, she could see understanding dawning in Morrison's experienced eyes. "Industrial espionage?" he asked quietly. "Possibly, or something more serious. The point is, there are people aboard this aircraft who are not who they claim to be, and they're traveling with materials they don't want scrutinized too closely." The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, sharp with impatience. "Ghost, homeplate, time's up. I need your assessment." Ghost looked around the cockpit at the faces of 3 men who had placed their trust in her judgment. Outside the windows, the F-15s maintained their relentless vigil, waiting for orders that could transform this situation from tense standoff to international incident. "Homeplate Ghost," she said into the microphone. "I have identified several passengers whose behavior and documentation warrant further investigation. However, I see no immediate threat to flight safety or national security that would justify military diversion." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Ghost could hear her own heartbeat, could sense the collective held breath of everyone in the cockpit. Everything depended on Rodriguez's next words. "Ghost, can you be more specific about these passengers?" "Negative, sir. Not on an open channel. But I recommend that appropriate authorities meet this aircraft upon landing at its scheduled destination for discreet questioning." Another pause, this one filled with the weight of command decision. Ghost had given Rodriguez a way out, a compromise that would allow him to save face while avoiding the public relations nightmare of forcing a civilian airliner to land at a military base. "Copy that, Ghost. Raptor flight, this is home plate. Break off intercept and return to base. Flight 847, you are cleared to continue to your destination." The relief in the cockpit was palpable. Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly as tension he'd been carrying for over an hour finally began to dissipate. Hayes allowed herself a small smile, while Webb looked like a man who just discovered he could breathe again. "Thank you, Colonel," Morrison said quietly. "I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Ghost nodded, but her expression remained serious. "Captain, this isn't over. When we land, there are going to be federal agents waiting. Some of your passengers are going to have a very difficult conversation ahead of them." "But not military diversion." "No, sir, not military diversion." As Ghost made her way back through the cabin toward her seat, she could feel the gradual relaxation that came as passengers sensed the crisis passing, without fully understanding what had threatened them. The flight attendants were already moving through the aisles with refreshment service, their professional smiles genuine once again. But as she passed row 15, Ghost caught James Whitmore's eye, and in that brief moment of contact, she saw acknowledgement. He knew that she knew. Whatever game he was playing, whatever operation was unfolding in the shadows of this routine commercial flight, it had just become infinitely more complicated. Ghost settled back into seat 11C with the satisfaction of someone who had prevented a catastrophe through careful judgment and professional skill. But she also felt the nagging awareness that came with unfinished business. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger mystery remained unsolved. Outside her window, the F-15s were already banking away, their mission incomplete but their orders clear. Soon they would be nothing more than distant specks against the afternoon sky, leaving Flight 847 to continue its journey as if nothing had happened. But Ghost knew better. In the intelligence community, there were no coincidences, and there were no operations that ended cleanly without consequences. Whatever had brought those fighters to intercept this particular flight was part of something larger, something that wouldn't simply disappear because a veteran pilot had talked her way out of a military diversion. As the aircraft continued westward, Ghost closed her eyes and tried to rest, but her mind remained alert, cataloging details and possibilities. The real work, she suspected, would begin after they landed. 2 hours later, United Flight 847 touched down at Denver International Airport with the gentle precision that marked the end of routine commercial flights around the world. But as the aircraft taxied toward its gate, Ghost could see through her window that this arrival would be anything but routine. Federal agents in dark suits waited near the jet bridge, their positions carefully coordinated to ensure that no passenger could leave the arrival area without scrutiny. Ghost recognized the setup. This was how the Bureau handled sensitive extractions when they needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy while conducting serious business. As passengers began the usual ritual of gathering carry-on luggage and shuffling toward the exits, Ghost remained in her seat, watching. She saw James Whitmore in the aisle 3 rows ahead, his diplomatic passport clutched in his hand like a shield. Behind him, Dr. Elena Vasquez moved with the careful control of someone who knew she was walking into an interrogation. Marcus Chen was one of the first passengers off the aircraft. His pharmaceutical sales cover story about to face scrutiny from people who specialized in separating truth from fiction. Ghost wondered if his nervousness was due to genuine criminal activity or simply the normal fear of someone whose cover identity was about to be professionally dismantled. "Ma'am," Webb appeared at her elbow looking uncertain. "Shouldn't we be getting off?" "We will, Sergeant, but let's let the interesting passengers leave first." Ghost watched through the small window as federal agents smoothly intercepted specific individuals in the jet bridge, guiding them toward private rooms where conversations would be held away from public view. The operation was executed with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested months of planning and coordination. "Colonel," Morrison's voice came from behind her. The captain had left his cockpit to personally thank the woman who had likely saved his career from the nightmare of military diversion. "I wanted to shake your hand before you disappear into whatever debriefing they have planned for you." Ghost stood and accepted the offered handshake, nodding the genuine gratitude in Morrison's weathered face. "You did good work today, Captain. You kept your passengers safe and your aircraft under control in a situation that could have gone very badly." "Only because you were here," Morrison replied. "I've been flying commercial for 28 years, and I've never had military fighters intercept my aircraft. I hope I never do again." "You handled it like a professional. Your passengers never knew how close things came to going sideways." As Ghost finally made her way off the aircraft, she found herself thinking about the strange mathematics of crisis, how a random seat assignment and a chance nap had put her in position to prevent what could have been a significant incident. In the intelligence world, some people called it luck. Ghost preferred to think of it as the universe's way of putting the right person in the right place when it mattered most. The federal agent who met her at the gate was young, serious, and obviously briefed on who she was. "Colonel Reyes, Special Agent Martinez, FBI. Could we have a few minutes of your time?" "Of course," Ghost replied, though she suspected that a few minutes would stretch into several hours of detailed debriefing. As they walked through the airport toward a discreet office facility, Ghost caught glimpses of her fellow passengers from Flight 847 continuing their journeys, most of them unaware that they had been part of something that would likely never make the evening news but would generate classified reports for months to come. The debriefing lasted 4 hours and covered every detail of Ghost's